The evening had been nothing but ordinary, a family gathering at his parents' house, filled with the usual conversations, laughter, and the warm smell of home-cooked meals. My husband was at my side, his arm draped casually around my chair, his fingers tracing light circles on my shoulder. I should have felt content, at ease. But then he walked in. It wasn't as if I hadn't seen him before. He had always been there, part of my husband's life long before I had entered it. The sibling from another mother, raised under the same roof, bonded by childhood memories and brotherly affection. To me, he had always been nothing more than that, an extension of my husband's family. Familiar. Safe. Yet tonight, something shifted. It was in the way his eyes found mine across the room. The way his gaze lingered just a second too long before he looked away. It sent a strange pulse through my body, a flicker of awareness that I couldn't shake off. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing. But later, when I was making my way down the narrow hallway toward the restroom, I turned a corner and nearly collided into him. "Sorry," I murmured instinctively. He didn't move. Didn't step aside. Just stood there too close. The space between us shrunk in an instant, leaving no room for indifference. His scent, woodsy, clean, laced with something faintly familiar, wrapped around me before I could take a step back. His gaze flickered downward for the briefest moment, and when he looked back up, there was something in his expression that made my stomach tighten. Recognition. Like he had noticed it too. Like he had felt the same shift. I felt my fingers tighten against the fabric of my dress. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady but my pulse erratic. So he didn't move right away. And for a split second, something unsaid passed between us. A silent question. A moment of curiosity neither of us had the courage to acknowledge. Then with a slow, measured step he shifted to the side. I walked past him without another word. But I felt his eyes on me as I went. And long after I had returned to the safety of my husband's side, that moment still clung to my skin like a whisper, like a warning. Something had changed. I just didn't know what. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be. That moment in the hallway. It meant nothing. Just a trick of the mind, a coincidence, a brief misinterpretation of body language and proximity. Nothing more. And yet, when I lay beside my husband that night, his warmth radiating against my back, his breath even and steady in sleep, I found myself wide awake. Thinking. Feeling. That brief encounter shouldn't have stayed with me. Shouldn't have followed me into the darkness of my bedroom. Shouldn't have left its imprint on my skin, my thoughts. I was happy. My marriage was good. My husband was kind, devoted, attentive. Everything a woman should ever want in a partner. Then why did my mind replay that moment over and over like a song stuck in an endless loop? Why had my body reacted as if it had recognized something dangerous, forbidden, exhilarating? I didn't have an answer. The next morning I went about my routine as usual. I kissed my husband goodbye, I went to work, I met a friend for coffee. Normal. Safe. Familiar. And yet he was still there. In my thoughts. Lingering like an unanswered question. I told myself that it was only because it was recent that it would fade. That once the memory lost its sharp edges, it would dissolve into nothingness. I was wrong. A few days later we found ourselves in the same room again. This time at a family gathering, an early weekend brunch. The house was crowded, filled with chatter and movement, and yet I felt him before I even saw him. Like an awareness humming just beneath my skin. I forced myself to act normal, to avoid his gaze, to focus on my husband's easy laughter, on the clinking of plates and the warm aroma of fresh-baked bread filling the air. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, my eyes lifted. He was across the room, standing near the window, a drink in his hand, engaged in light conversation. But the moment my gaze landed on him, his head tilted slightly as if he'd been waiting for me to look. I froze. It was so subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to me, it felt deliberate. My stomach clenched, my heart quickened. I forced myself to look away, to turn my attention back to the table, to my husband's gentle hand resting on my knee. But the damage had already been done. The shift had already happened. A game had begun. One that neither of us had spoken into existence, but both of us had acknowledged without a single word. That night I told myself it was over. That whatever this strange, fleeting tension was, it would fade. But then the text came. It happened by accident, or at least that's what I told myself. I had been messaging my best friend, quickly responding to a casual conversation, and in the rush of tapping on my phone, I had somehow clicked on his name. The realization hit me the moment the message sent. I froze. I felt my stomach drop, my pulse hammer in my throat. The text itself had been harmless, just a generic response meant for someone else. But the fact that I had messaged him at all felt like a mistake I couldn't undo. Before I could even think of unsending it, his reply popped up. "Did you mean to text me?" The air left my lungs. I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I could have ignored it. Could have said it was a mistake, could have laughed it off and pretended it never happened. Instead, my fingers moved on their own. "Sorry. Wrong person." A few seconds passed. Then another message. "Shame." One word. A simple, weightless reply. And yet it felt like a match against dry wood. A flicker of something dangerous waiting to be set aflame. I locked my phone. Put it face down on the table. Tried to pretend I didn't feel the heat spreading in my chest. But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days that followed were a battle against myself. I tried to convince myself that it was just a moment, that his reply meant nothing, that my reaction had been irrational, exaggerated, misplaced. I told myself that I had imagined the way my stomach had tightened, the way my breath had caught, the way my fingers had hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary. It was nothing. And yet I didn't delete the message thread. I could have. I should have. Instead, I found myself rereading it at odd hours of the night, the simple exchange playing in my mind like a whisper, a question without an answer. Shame. A word that had no weight yet felt like a stone in my chest. I tried to move on, to shake the feeling, to remind myself of what mattered. My husband. Our life. The love we shared. But then fate laughed in my face. The night that changed everything. My husband was scheduled for a weekend business trip. It wasn't unusual. His job often required him to fly out for a few days, leaving me to my own routines. Morning workouts, quiet evenings with a book, the occasional dinner with a friend. I didn't expect anything different this time. But then his mother called. A small family gathering. Casual, nothing formal. Just a few relatives, a dinner, an excuse to spend time together. My husband had already left, but she insisted I come. And so I went. I told myself it would be fine. That he would be there, yes, but I would be polite, I would keep my distance, I would act as if nothing had changed. The moment I walked through the door, I knew I had lied to myself. He was already there, leaning casually against the kitchen counter, his fingers wrapped around the neck of a beer bottle. He saw me before I saw him. I felt it. That unspoken pull. That awareness that now felt as natural as breathing. And when our eyes met, the shift was instant. A flicker of something too fast to catch, too subtle to name. I forced myself to break the stare, to move forward, to smile at the others, to act normal. But he knew. And I knew he knew. The moment it all fell apart. It happened when I went to retrieve something from the garage. The house was full of people, the conversations loud and easy. My mother-in-law had asked me to grab a bottle of wine from the storage in the back, so I slipped away, eager for a moment of solitude. I found the bottle easily enough, reaching for it on the wooden shelf. But just as I turned, the door clicked shut. I froze. The garage was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the small window near the ceiling. I turned, half expecting to find someone else. But it was him. Leaning against the door, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. For a second neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and charged, like a storm waiting to break. I swallowed. The door. He didn't move. "Did you close it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He held my gaze for a beat longer before tilting his head slightly. "Would you have preferred I left it open?" The question wasn't innocent. I should have said yes. I should have told him to leave, to open the door, to let me pass. Instead I stood there, wine bottle clutched in my hands, pulse roaring in my ears. "You're avoiding me," he said after a pause. "I'm not." "You are." A beat of silence. Then quieter, slower. "Why?" I clenched my jaw. "I think you know why." His lips curved, not a smile, not quite. Just the ghost of something amused, something knowing. I hated how easily he read me. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly. I blinked. Regret what? The text. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to shut it all down, to pretend like none of it had meant anything. But I hesitated. And that hesitation was enough. He took a step forward. Just one. Just enough to make the space between us dangerously small. If you regretted it, he said, voice low, too close, you would have deleted it. My breath caught. He wasn't touching me. He didn't have to. The air crackled between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I shook my head, half in denial, half in some feeble attempt to clear my thoughts. This is insane. Maybe, he agreed. But that doesn't mean it's not real. His words sank into my skin, into my ribs, into the places I had tried to ignore for days, weeks. He wasn't wrong. And that terrified me. I needed to leave. I needed to open the door, to walk past him, to return to the party, to forget this moment before it became something I couldn't erase. But he moved first. Not much. Just enough to shift his weight forward, to close the remaining inches without hesitation. And then, his lips met mine. It wasn't slow. It wasn't careful. It was heat and recklessness, a clash of something inevitable, something that had been waiting to happen since the moment our eyes first met. I should have stopped it. I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back. The wine bottle slipped from my grip, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a warning screamed, "This is wrong, this is dangerous, this is irreversible." But my body didn't care. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, shaken, utterly ruined. I opened my mouth, to say something, to undo what had just happened. But before I could, a voice called from the house. The moment shattered. I stumbled back, heart hammering, hands trembling. His eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, waiting. And in that moment I knew, this was only the beginning. I barely remembered how I got back to the dinner table. My heart was still racing, my lips tingling with the ghost of his kiss. I felt flushed, overheated, as if I had stepped into a different version of reality, one where I had just made a choice I could never take back. Everything around me looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. The voices at the table blurred together, the clinking of glasses and forks against porcelain barely registering. My husband sat beside me, his hand occasionally brushing against mine as he reached for something, utterly unaware that my entire world had just tilted on its axis. I tried to focus. I tried to act normal. But my skin still burned, and every time I glanced up, my eyes searched for him. And he was already looking. Across the table our eyes met, and in that instant, everything crashed down on me at once. The weight of what I had just done. The undeniable pull that had led me here. The fact that this wasn't something I could excuse as a mistake, because mistakes didn't feel like this. I tore my gaze away and forced a sip of wine down my throat, barely tasting it. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the glass back down. My husband didn't notice. No one did. But he did. I felt his attention on me like static electricity in the air, and it was unbearable. I needed to leave. To put distance between myself and whatever this was becoming. The moment the opportunity presented itself, I excused myself from the table, murmuring something about fresh air. No one questioned it. They never did. I stepped outside onto the patio, inhaling the crisp night air, trying to cool the fire beneath my skin. The night was quiet except for the distant hum of the city beyond the fence. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against my temples, willing my pulse to slow down, to steady. But I wasn't alone. I knew before I even turned around. The awareness came first, the sharp sensation of being watched, of being followed. And then a shift in the air behind me. I turned and there he was. He leaned against the wooden railing, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Neither should you." Something inside me twisted. The truth of his words, the weight of them, it settled deep, too heavy, too real. I should have walked away then. I should have left without another word, without another glance. But I didn't. Because the part of me that knew this was wrong wasn't loud enough to drown out the part that didn't care. He took a slow step closer and my breath hitched. "I need to forget this happened," I whispered, though I didn't know if I was saying it for him or for myself. A humorless smile tugged at his lips. "Do you think that's possible?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to cling to that idea like a lifeline. But deep down I already knew the answer. He didn't press further. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to unravel me. And then a voice called from inside, breaking the moment, forcing me back to reality. I turned and left without looking back. But even as I rejoined the others, Even as I sat beside my husband and let his familiar presence ground me, I knew it was useless. Because some things once started couldn't be undone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I felt it all over again. The way he looked at me, the way I had let him. I kept thinking about my husband beside me, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. He loved me. He trusted me. And I had kissed his brother. The guilt should have consumed me. But the worst part? It didn't. It didn't hurt enough to make me stop wanting more. The next morning I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I made coffee, I read emails, I smoothed my hair in the mirror and pretended I didn't feel different. But when my phone buzzed, everything inside me froze. A message. I knew who it was before I even reached for it. I hesitated. I told myself to ignore it. But my fingers moved anyway. We need to talk. It was reckless. It was stupid. And yet my hands trembled as I typed back. Where? Because no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself this was my chance to stop, to put distance between us, to let this dissolve into nothing more than a fleeting mistake. But by the time the sun had set, I was already in my car, fingers gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my pulse pounding in my throat. The location he had chosen was neutral. A quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one would recognize us, where we could be just two people meeting over coffee, nothing more. But it wasn't nothing. I knew it. He knew it. And yet I still walked inside. He was already there, seated in the back, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his coffee cup. He looked calm, collected, as if this was just another conversation. But his eyes, they betrayed him. They tracked my movements the moment I stepped through the door. They burned with something unspoken. I sat across from him, my hands settling into my lap, pressing down against my thighs as if that could still the tremor in my fingers. Neither of us spoke right away. The silence between us was thick, stretched too tight, filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. When the waitress appeared, I ordered a coffee I wouldn't drink. Then finally he spoke. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice even, unreadable. I let out a breath. "I know." His gaze locked onto mine, sharp, assessing. "Then why are you here?" It was a simple question. But there was no simple answer. I looked away, my fingers curling into my palm. "I don't know." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if he didn't believe me. Neither did I. The silence stretched between us again, and for a moment, I let myself study him. I had known him for years. I had seen him in every possible setting. Family dinners, holidays, celebrations, casual moments at home. He had always been there, a permanent figure in my husband's life, in mine. But now he looked like someone new. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. The tension between us was unbearable, a slow pull that neither of us could ignore. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "We need to stop this before." "Before what?" he interrupted, his voice lower now. "Before it goes too far?" I nodded, even though it already had. His fingers tapped against the table, his expression unreadable. "You're lying to yourself." I stiffened. "Excuse me. You wouldn't be here if you actually wanted to stop." The words hit too deep, cutting through my carefully constructed walls. He was right. And that terrified me. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. Because we both knew the truth. Every step I had taken up until this moment had been a choice. I had chosen to look at him too long that night at dinner. I had chosen to stand still when he had closed the door in the garage. I had chosen to kiss him back. And now I had chosen to meet him here. There was no point in pretending anymore. I exhaled shakily and forced myself to meet his gaze. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice quieter now, less certain than I wanted it to be. He studied me for a long moment, his fingers tightening around his cup before he finally leaned back in his chair. "If that's what you really want," he said, his tone unreadable. I nodded. "It is." But neither of us moved. Neither of us left. And that silence between us, that unbearable pull, it didn't fade. It only grew stronger. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it in front of me with a polite smile. I barely noticed. I couldn't. Because under the table, out of sight, his knee brushed against mine. A simple touch. Barely noticeable. But it sent fire through my veins. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. The choice had been made before I even realized I was making it. I lifted my coffee cup, took a slow sip, pretended like I wasn't already losing this battle. And when he finally stood, dropping a few bills on the table, he didn't say another word. He just looked at me one last time as if waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. So he left. And I stayed. But the moment the door shut behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I had told him this couldn't happen again. And yet, as I sat there staring at the untouched coffee in front of me, all I could think about was the next time I would see him again. Because this wasn't over. It never had been. I spent the next few days trying to pretend nothing had changed. Routine became my refuge. I woke up early, made coffee, checked emails, went through the motions of my day as if I wasn't unraveling beneath the surface. My husband kissed me in the mornings before heading to work, and I kissed him back like I always had. But something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't place back where it belonged. I told myself that meeting him at the cafe had been closure, that we had said what needed to be said, that it was over. But the truth sat heavy in my chest, impossible to ignore. Because when my phone buzzed, I still checked too quickly. When I walked into a room filled with people, my eyes still searched for him first. And when I was alone, I still felt the ghost of his knee pressing against mine beneath the table, a sensation so faint yet impossible to forget. It should have ended there. But then it happened again. My husband had asked me to pick up his dry cleaning on my way home. It was a small, mundane task, something I had done 100 times before. But that day, as I pulled into the parking lot, my breath caught in my throat. Because he was already there. Standing beside his car, phone in hand, looking just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. For a second, neither of us moved. And then, just like before, it was already too late. He put his phone away, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. Waiting. I could have ignored him. Could have turned away, acted as if he were just another stranger in a crowded city. But I didn't. Because I never did. Instead, I walked toward him, my pulse beating too fast, too loud. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told a different story. "Running into you is starting to feel less like an accident," he said, his voice calm, but there was something else underneath it. I let out a breath, my fingers tightening around my purse strap. "It is an accident." Pause. A small smile. "If you say so." I hated how easily he got under my skin. Hated how he always seemed to know exactly what I was thinking, even when I didn't say a word. The silence between us stretched, charged and heavy. I glanced toward the dry cleaner's entrance, knowing I should go inside, knowing this moment was dangerous, yet unable to make my feet move. "You're still trying to convince yourself this isn't real," he said quietly. I turned back to him sharply. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't want you to say anything," he murmured. "I just want you to stop lying to yourself." Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was the fact that he was right and I hated him for it. Because no matter how hard I tried to pretend, this wasn't something I could walk away from. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I stepped forward, closing the small space between us, and for a split second I saw the shift in his expression. The way his jaw tightened. The way his fingers curled slightly as if resisting the urge to reach for me first. But I didn't give him time to hesitate. I kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was heat and frustration, a reckless surrender to everything I had spent weeks trying to deny. His hands found my waist, gripping tight, pulling me flush against him, and suddenly the world outside just didn't exist. The cars in the parking lot. The city buzzing around us. The fact that I was still wearing my wedding ring. None of it mattered. Because in that moment he was the only thing that existed. I didn't stop. I didn't want to. His fingers trailed up my back, his touch igniting every nerve in my body. The way he kissed me was desperate, like he had been waiting for this just as much as I had. Maybe he had. Maybe this had been inevitable from the moment our eyes first met across the dinner table that night. But then the sound of a car door slamming somewhere in the distance shattered the moment. I jerked back, breathless, my hands trembling as I pulled away. He didn't move right away. His eyes searched mine, his breathing ragged as if trying to memorize the way I looked at him in that moment. And then quietly he whispered, "Now what?" The question hung between us, unanswered. Because I didn't know. I turned away before I could change my mind, walking quickly toward the entrance of the dry cleaner, my heart still hammering. My reflection stared back at me from the glass door. Flushed cheeks. swollen lips, guilt sinking its claws deep into my ribs. I took a shaky breath and pushed the door open, pretending, for now, that I could still go back to the life I had before him. I drove home with shaking hands. The world outside blurred past me, neon signs and streetlights melting together into meaningless streaks of color, but all I could feel was the lingering burn of his lips on mine. My skin still tingled where his hands had been, as if his touch had branded me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus, trying to pull myself out of the moment, but the air inside the car felt too thick, too charged with the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't a mistake anymore. A mistake was something you could explain away. Something you could brush off as an accident, a lapse in judgment. But this was a choice. I had chosen to kiss him. Chosen to let my body move before my mind could stop it. And worst of all, I wanted to do it again. The thought made my stomach twist, but it wasn't guilt that made my fingers tremble on the wheel. It was anticipation. I pulled into the driveway, my heart pounding as I turned off the engine. The house was dark except for the porch light, the warm glow of the living room lamps spilling onto the curtains. My husband was already home. For a long moment I just sat there staring at the front door. I could still feel his breath on my skin. I exhaled sharply and forced myself to move, stepping out of the car and locking it behind me. My hands were cold despite the heat of the night, my mind racing in circles as I approached the door. I hesitated just before turning the handle, closing my eyes, bracing myself. Then I stepped inside. The air smelled like home. Clean, familiar, safe. The scent of my husband's cologne still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint trace of freshly brewed tea. The sound of the television hummed softly from the living room. Everything was normal. Exactly as I had left it. And yet I felt like a stranger in my own life. I found him sitting on the couch, feet propped up on the coffee table, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. His face lit up when he saw me. "You're home late," he said, setting the remote down. "Everything okay?" His voice was warm, trusting. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah. Just ran a few errands." He stretched, running a hand through his hair before reaching for his cup of tea. I was about to head to bed. "You coming?" I hesitated. Everything in me screamed no. I needed space, needed time, needed to be alone with the storm raging inside me. But I couldn't give him a reason why. So I nodded. "Yeah, just give me a few minutes." He didn't question it. He just smiled, leaned over to kiss my cheek and disappeared down the hall. The second he was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I stood there in the dim glow of the living room, feeling the weight of my own choices settle onto my shoulders. I had kissed another man. And now I was about to slide into bed beside my husband, lie next to him as if nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. I went through the motions of getting ready for bed in a daze. Washing my face, brushing my teeth, slipping into a pair of shorts and a loose t-shirt. But every time I closed my eyes I saw him. The way he had looked at me just before I kissed him. The way his hands had claimed me without hesitation. I turned off the bathroom light and climbed into bed beside my husband, careful not to move too close. His breathing was already slow, steady, his body relaxed in sleep. But I lay awake. My eyes traced the patterns on the ceiling, my mind spinning in restless circles. I thought the guilt would come. That it would consume me, tear me apart from the inside. But instead there was only the ache of wanting more. I had spent so long convincing myself that I wouldn't cross the line, that I could keep my distance, that this was just some fleeting moment of temptation. But that was a lie. And the worst part? Now that I had tasted it, I didn't know if I could stop. I barely slept that night. When morning came, I went through the motions on autopilot, made coffee, kissed my husband goodbye, answered emails, pretended to be fine. But underneath it all, there was only one thought looping through my mind. Would I see him again? I told myself I wouldn't. That I would stay away. But when my phone buzzed that afternoon, I didn't even hesitate before checking. And when I saw his name on the screen, my pulse spiked. Meet me. 2 words. That was all. No time. No location. Just an unspoken understanding that I already knew the answer. And I did. Because I had already decided. I wasn't going to stop. I typed my reply with steady fingers. Where? The answer came almost immediately. And that was how, just a few hours later, I found myself driving to meet him again. Because whatever this was, it had already consumed me. The drive to meet him felt different this time. There was no hesitation. No second guessing. No whisper of guilt trying to pull me back. That part of me, the one that had resisted, that had told itself there was still a way out, was gone. Burned away the second I kissed him. Now there was only this. A low hum of anticipation coiled in my stomach as I followed the GPS directions, gripping the steering wheel tighter every time the screen counted down the remaining miles. I had no idea where exactly he was taking me. All he had sent was an address. A location on the map. But I had gone anyway. Because I already knew the only thing that mattered. He would be there. The place was just outside the city, tucked away behind quiet streets and lined with trees that stretched high enough to cast everything in shifting shadows. It wasn't secluded, not really, but it felt that way. Like a pocket of the world no one else could see. I pulled into the small lot, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel as I scanned the area. And then there he was. Leaning against his car, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze already locked on mine before I had even parked. A slow, quiet storm built inside me at the sight of him. I killed the engine, but I didn't move right away. I could feel it, the weight of what I was about to do pressing against my ribs, the sharp thrill of knowing I wasn't going to stop. This was beyond logic now. Beyond control. I stepped out of the car, letting the door shut behind me with a quiet thud. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. I could already see everything in his expression. The same pull, the same hunger, the same reckless certainty that had taken root inside me. The moment stretched, charged with something we both understood but still hadn't spoken into existence. Then finally he moved. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough to close the space between us, to eliminate the thin layer of distance still left. My breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist, barely touching, but enough to make my pulse hammer against my skin. "You came," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "So did you?" His lips twitched at that, like I had amused him somehow. But there was nothing light about this moment. Nothing easy. Only heat. Only tension. Only the slow, inevitable unraveling of every last reason I had ever tried to resist. A car passed in the distance, its headlights cutting through the fading light, but I barely noticed. Because he was closer now. And my body was already reacting before my mind could even catch up. The brush of his fingers against my skin became something more, something deliberate. A slow drag of his hand along my forearm, his fingertips tracing patterns I couldn't see but felt everywhere. I let out a slow, uneven breath, but I didn't move away. I didn't want to. "You know what happens if we don't stop," he murmured. I nodded. "I know." But neither of us moved. Neither of us stepped back. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. We were never going to stop. Not now. Not after everything that had already happened. And so, when he finally closed the last bit of space between us, I didn't resist. His hands found my waist, fingers pressing against fabric, against skin, against the fire already threatening to consume me whole. I felt it. The pull, the need, the way my body melted against his like it had been waiting for this all along. And then his lips met mine. The world blurred. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just let go. There was no caution this time. No hesitation, no guilt creeping in at the edges. Only fire. Only the way he pulled me closer, the way I fit against him, the way everything else fell away. And for the first time I let myself feel it without fighting. Let myself drown in it. A sharp sound shattered the moment. A door closing. A voice, faint, distant. But enough to snap reality back into place like a whip cracking against the air. We tore apart, breathless, eyes wide, the rush of what we had just done still thick in the air between us. My pulse pounded, my heart hammering in my ribs as I forced myself to look away, forced my body to step back even though every cell in me screamed don't. A man walked past a few cars down, barely sparing us a glance before disappearing into one of the nearby buildings. A coincidence. A moment of nothing. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like a warning. Like the universe reminding me that we weren't invisible. That what we were doing wasn't without consequence. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his breathing still uneven. I pressed my fingers against my lips, still swollen from the kiss, and finally met his gaze again. We had gone too far. And we both knew it. But even as logic clawed its way back in, even as reality tried to reassert itself, I still felt it. The ache. The need. The impossible certainty that this wasn't going to stop. Not here. Not now. Not ever. And that terrified me more than anything else. I didn't go home right away. After I left him standing in that dimly lit parking lot, after I forced myself to walk away, I drove aimlessly through the city. The streets were quieter now, the hum of the day settling into something slower, something softer. But inside me there was nothing soft. Everything was sharp edges and reckless hunger, a collision of emotions I couldn't untangle. I could still feel him. His touch. His lips. The way he had held me, like he had known I wouldn't pull away this time. Like he had stopped waiting for me to run. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles turning white. The weight of what I had just done pressed down on me, but it wasn't guilt that made my chest feel tight. It was the need for more. That was the worst part. I should have felt ashamed. I should have been drowning in regret, in the reality of what this meant, what it could destroy. But all I could think about was when I could see him again. The thought made my stomach twist, my pulse hammer harder. I was losing myself. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. When I finally pulled into the driveway, my husband's car was already there. The porch light cast a warm glow across the front steps, the house looking exactly as it had this morning. Exactly as it always had. But when I stepped inside, something felt different. Or maybe it was just me. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air, something rich and warm, but my appetite was gone. The sound of the television played faintly from the living room, but it barely registered. I felt detached from everything, like I had stepped into a version of my life I no longer fit inside. Then I saw him. Sitting on the couch, his head tilted back, eyes closed, one hand resting on his stomach. He looked peaceful. Unbothered. Completely unaware that his wife had spent the evening kissing someone else. The sight of him made my chest tighten, but not because of guilt. Because I still loved him. That was what made this unbearable. I loved my husband. I loved the life we had built, the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the warmth of waking up beside him every morning. And yet I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop wanting someone else. The realization sat heavy in my chest, suffocating. I stood there for too long, unmoving, watching him as if he were a stranger. As if I had already left this life behind and was just now realizing it. Then, as if sensing my presence, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and when they landed on me, he smiled. A soft, easy smile. The kind that used to make me feel safe. "You're home late," he murmured, voice laced with sleep. I forced my lips into a small smile. "Yeah. Lost track of time." He nodded, stretching his arms before sitting up. "Come here." I hesitated. The request was simple. "Come here." But for the first time it felt like the hardest thing in the world. Because I knew what would happen if I did. I would sit beside him, he would pull me close, press a kiss to my hair, ask me about my day. And I would lie. Like I had been lying for weeks. Like I had been lying to myself. But I went anyway. Because that was the worst part of all. I wasn't ready to lose this life. Not yet. Not when I still didn't know how this story ended. He wrapped an arm around me as I sat beside him, pulling me into the familiar warmth of his body. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into it. Letting myself pretend for just a moment that I wasn't unraveling from the inside out. That I wasn't already too far gone. Because I knew deep down this wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until the next time I saw him. And I already knew there would be a next time.